Welcome back. Today we're gonna talk about two simple methods to get perfect exposure every time. So let's go. Okay, let's start. To understand exposure, you need to understand dynamic range. And when talking about dynamic range, there's two types that I want to talk about. The first is the dynamic range of the scene. How big difference is there in reality between dark and the lightest parts of your scene? The second is the dynamic range of the camera. How much can the camera capture at once? So, as a metaphor, exposure is like a baseball glove trying to catch a ball. The ball being the dynamic range of the scene and the glove being the dynamic range of the camera. So you move the glove or the dynamic range of the camera by changing settings like ISO, aperture and shutter speed and ND filters. If the dynamic range of the scene is narrow and your camera's dynamic range is wide, then you have more wiggle room to move the glove. If the dynamic range of the scene is wide and your camera's dynamic range is narrow, you'll not be able to capture it all and you'll lose part of the information to black shadows or clipped highlights, so bad luck. Okay, so what is correct exposure then? All surfaces have a corresponding video luminance value when lit and exposed correctly. Many times this value is unknown, but still it exists. To have a correct exposure, a simple way is to have something in the frame, for example this, that you know the corresponding luminance value of. Then set the exposure according to that, right in camera or in post. So, when you have a reference as a target and you set your exposure to that, everything else in the same light will fall into its corresponding values as well, and you'll have a correct exposure. Okay, so from this we'll get to the first method. So the first method to set exposure that I use, to set my exposure correct right in camera using a target, just like this. The easiest way to do this is to have an 18% gray card, but you can do this with any flat unicolor surface as long as you know the corresponding luminance value of it. I'm using an x-rite color passport that has a big patch that I know the corresponding luminance value of. I'll do a video where I'll show you how to use anything as an exposure target later on, so subscribe to the channel to see that in the near future. But anyway, let's continue. So to do this first method in practice, first, you set your camera's built-in light meter to spot mode. Second, bring the target next to your subject or in the exact same light and facing the light you want to expose to, because the angle of the target affects its brightness and your exposure by that as well. Third, set your spot meter to the target and then set your exposure according to the target. Okay, so you set your exposure to the target. Done. There is pros and cons to this method. Pros are that when you use this method, you'll have a correct and consistent exposure in post to start from. But there's cons. And the cons are that you can't always get the target next to your subject, as if you're shooting architecture, for example. And sometimes you can't have the correct exposure without your highlights clipping. For example, if there would be something brighter in the background that might end up being clipped. So then we get to the second method. This method is called exposing to the right, by the way. So the second method I use is to set your exposure so that the dynamic range of the scene falls into the right side of the dynamic range of the camera without highlights clipping. You can let light source and reflections clip if you need, but protect your highlight areas. The reason to use this method is that the image quality of your sensor's dynamic range is better at the right side. Image noise lives in the left side of the dynamic range. If the dynamic range of the scene is rather narrow, you can just capture a bit brighter exposure instead of pushing it all the way. Then bring the exposure down to correct level in post. If the dynamic range of the scene is rather wide, still protect the highlights and let your shadows fall into the darkness. If your subject is a bit darker than you want, you can correct that in post. Okay, now let me show you quickly how to use the second method in practice with a camera. This camera is the GH5 that I'm using, but the same principles apply to all cameras. So the first thing that we have to have is some kind of a tool to know what part of the scene is clipping. And with the GH5, and I guess most of these professional cameras or semi-professional cameras, the best tool for that is ZBrush. So set your zebras to whatever value is the clipping point for your profile. If you're using normal profiles in the GH5, the clipping point is 100%, but if you're using Vlog, then the clipping point is 80%, just that you know. And then, as I see, if I open up if I slow down the shutter, you will have these zebras showing me that the highlights or the sky area is clipped. So to do this method, I simply just lower my exposure by using the shutter or using the aperture or using the ISO, so that none of the highlight areas have those zebras anymore, so they are not anymore clipping. So there I have a good exposure, and if I want, I can bring up these dark areas in post to the exposure level that I want. So that's very simple. Just protect the highlights and you'll end up with much more filmic image. Of course, you can always make the decision on considering some highlight areas to be light sources instead. For example, if you have windows in your scene. In some cases, you can just let them clip and it will still look good. To make your post-processing easier, try to add a target to your clips so you can use it as a reference in post to set your exposure correct. And this method has pros and cons as well. The pros are that this method is rather fast and you'll maximize the dynamic range of your camera and you capture a cleaner image. But the cons are that not all cameras and all color profiles, they are not a good match for this, because some color profiles modify the image so much that changing the exposure in post might cause some issues. So test this before you start using it with your camera and color profile. And the second one is that if you try to push your exposure to the edge, you sometimes push it too far and end up clipping your information, especially with skin tone. Don't push the exposure all the way when exposing for good looking skin. Better leave some headroom. Okay, there you have the two methods. Next, let's go to the computer and let me show you a fast way to set the exposure correct in post. I have this footage of this big Buddha statue, and in the beginning of the clip I showed the camera this target. So let me show you how to use this target to set your exposure correct in post. To do that, I have created two very special lookup tables. This is if you use 18% gray cards, and this is if you use the same thing that I'm using, the x-rite color passport. So you choose the one that you're using. I'm using the x-rite, so I'll choose this. And then before the lookup table, I'll start adjusting the exposure until I see this target color filling the batch. And then I know that my exposure is correct, because I created this lookup table to turn red when this batch has the right luminance. And after that, you can turn off the lookup table, or maybe use some other lookup table, and then just copy the adjustment effect to the other layer, and there you go. That's very easy. And then remember that this is just a starting point for your color grading. If you decide to make a dark color grade, then you make your image dark. If you want to make a bright color grade, then you make your image bright. After this point, the color correction part doesn't matter anymore. It's just the starting point. I hope you learned something from this rather dense tutorial. To download the lookup table that I used, join my Facebook Messenger list and you can access my download vault there, where I have other stuff as well for you to use. The link is in the description for how to join the Messenger list. And then subscribe to the channel, for I'll be having more tutorials just like this sooner or later. Bye.